Thanks, Jeff. Yeah, happy to be here. This is the third user group for CAD Microsystems I've presented with. So again, a little bit more about myself. Roy Malcom, I'm a VDC manager with DPR. I support our Northeast region, lead all of our VDC operations throughout those 5 offices, which are Richmond, Reston, Baltimore, Edison, New Jersey, and Boston. I sit in Richmond. It's where I live in Ashland, just north of Richmond, but travel to all 5 of those offices. I just came from Boston today. Was a little worried I was going to miss my flight, but I made it. So again, glad to be here. A little bit about DPR. I don't want to give the traditional, here's what our company is, here's how many employees, that sort of thing. But I want to give you a fact that I think really defines who we are and really will kind of set the precedence for this presentation. So this is a picture of our Reston office, and DPR is the largest owner of net zero offices in North America. We own 4 net zero offices, are getting ready to open a 5th. And these are our offices we build for our own people, for their own enjoyment. These are amazing spaces that we live in, basically. So that's how much DPR cares about the well-being of their employees. And when we talk about VDC execution planning, that's one of the biggest reasons why it matters, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. Obviously, why does it matter? Same thing, Megan's, your presentation of not what it is, but why we actually do it, right? We call it a VDC execution plan instead of BIM, so we'll get into that too. We'll talk about a few of the essentials, what are kind of the biggest points of not only our plan, but really of any plan, and what you should look out for. And then how a VDC execution plan or a BIM execution plan can help with managing risk on a project, right? Because we know there's a lot with VDC. So why do we need it, right? So that biggest thing to me of taking care of people, and Megan touched on this, not having the interns stay until midnight working on a last minute change or scrambling. That's having that solid plan in place, everybody in alignment, understanding, and being aligned around that final goal. Because what is the final goal on every project, or what it should be, right? I mean, it's to deliver that final end product to the client. It has nothing to do with BIM. VDC and BIM are the tools that we use to accomplish that. So if we have that alignment early on, that's kind of the biggest piece, getting everybody on the same page. There's a ton of new risks right now with Revit and that whole process of what traditionally wasn't there, and how this plays into traditional processes. Like, we still have to deliver the permit sets, right? So we have these great models, but we're still bottlenecked by that process. And so how does BIM and VDC align with that? So I want to take a little bit and just define the difference between VDC and BIM, the way that DPR sees it. So pretty simple. BIM is the noun, a building information model, or building information modeling, actually creating that. VDC is taking that BIM and using that for virtual design and construction. So using all of that to build it first, and using those tools to execute the design and construction. So the term that we're starting to use is the digital twin. So basically that digital representation of the building itself. And we're figuring out all of the issues beforehand, at least supposedly, or cutting back on them. We're controlling our cost, we're controlling our schedule, we're meeting the expectations of the clients, right? And we can't do that unless we have the VDC execution plan that's solid. And before I move on, just want to touch on kind of the 4 big pieces of that VDC execution plan, right? So it's the people. We're all Revit BIM experts, but we are a very small part of the actual process, right? We cannot do it alone. It's the rest of the design team, the clients, all of the design consultants, the contractor, the non-BIM folks, the superintendents, the project managers, project engineers, MEP coordinators, and all of the trade partners as well, right? the process, so that's where the VDC Execution Plan comes in, tying all of that together and setting the expectations for, you know, how developed the models are at a certain point. What are those final deliverables? What software are we using? All that fun stuff. The technology, you know, that's a piece of it, but it's certainly not the most important, especially with all of the tools that are available out there today. It's really a matter of defining how those tools fit into the process. And I think the one then that often gets overlooked is metrics. So at DPR, we have a saying that if you're not keeping score, it's just practice. So really, what sort of metrics are we keeping from this process, and how are we using that data to inform decisions on future projects or even later on in that process, right? All right, so what is kind of the goal of a VDC execution plan? So understanding contractual obligations. So what does the client expect, right? So setting this process up with the end in mind. If they're expecting a, you know, Kobe standards delivery or turnover, that's a little bit different than just your standard Revit as-built model, right? So there's a lot of additional data and work that would need to go into that plan. So understanding that early on is key. Managing risk, like I mentioned, there's a lot of new opportunities for us to get in trouble with some of these processes, right? The way we share models, we're sharing more information than ever before, so who has access to that, how they use that information, all those things are what we need to consider. There's, going back to contractual obligations, there's a lot of risk involved there, so how are we, each individually, you know, between the contractor, the client, the architect, the engineering team, how are we all working collaboratively, but yet managing our own individual risks, or our portion of it. And again, aligning those expectations, right? So it's all that big gear, that big machine working together. So another way to think about it is we all kind of understand how to do BIM, right? Or at least to model. You know, we have Revit standards. We all are somewhat at least competent in modeling within Revit. I know I'm not an expert by any means, but we've kind of figured that out, right? And we also all have our own individual execution plans. So there's that can be tricky because our company execution plans aren't always the best for that particular project, right? So if there's an IPD or design assist or design build type project where lots of multiple firms coming together, we're all working on the models collaboratively, those plans need to jive or need to combine in some way that it suits everybody's needs without duplicating efforts or stepping on each other's toes, right? So that's kind of the overview of, you know, why we do it, why it's important. So we'll get into some of the essentials, or at least what we would consider the essentials from the contractor's point of view. So Megan mentioned Penn State and their execution planning guide. You know, DPR was a part of contributing to this plan when it came out, and it's heavily influenced our execution plans over the years. Some great stuff in there. Super technical, way too technical for my my taste. But I think kind of a good takeaway or a good piece of that is this quote, right? And that highlighted piece of all parties are clearly aware of the opportunities and responsibilities associated with the incorporation of BIM into the project workflow, right? I think that's a pretty powerful statement. So how do we do that? We're trying to shift our thinking with regards to VDC. It's not all about just developing a model to develop the 2D plans, right? Or it's not all about just doing MEP coordination. There's a lot of different things that go in it, and we talked about the 4 things before, but metrics is a part of all of this. But there's 3 big things. So BIM is a construction tool, right? But that tool is only as good as the people using it. So whether that's us, you know, the Revit power users and the BIM experts, so we get it, but how are the rest of the teams using it? How are they getting that information or deliverables from the model and using that for design and construction? And then that ties into the process, right? The people are only good as the process lets them be. Okay, so that biggest piece early on, before any modeling takes place, is aligning the expectations. So this is a chart that we use from our VDC execution plan, and it sets up the phases of the project from early design validation all the way through closeout and operations. And then we've defined some of the attended uses for the model, and that's the conversation we have early on. All right, are we going to use it? Obviously, there's a few things missing here, to be honest. I think this is from a construction-focused plan, but in a lot of them, there'll be more design options there as well, because we want to work collaboratively with the design team to help develop those goals. So again, we're not working in silos and developing plans separately that don't mesh well together. So in this one, we're talking about the validation. We're doing some early site analysis and then taking that all the way through facilities and asset management. So DPR actually has a subsidiary company called ViewOps that we take all of our facilities management data, and we're able to put that into a software, and it's a cloud-based platform that houses kind of our warranty claims and any facilities type information. It ties into building automation systems, and it's also a service too that ViewOps will work with clients to help develop their actual needs for a facilities maintenance program, right? But so say we're going to do something like that, and the colors here, the differences are dark blue is something we've agreed that we're absolutely 100% committed and going to do. This lighter blue is the likely that we're not sure. We still need to figure some things out. There's a strong opportunity there, and we're more than likely going to use it. And then the light blue is a kind of pie in the sky type opportunity. Here's some things we would like to accomplish. These should be goals for the project, but we're not going to commit to them at this time, right? So putting together this chart, this kind of helps us start that conversation. Okay, here's what our goals are VDC-wise, and this influences pretty much every other planning aspect of the project, right? From budgeting to scheduling to setting up your technical processes in the rest of the VDC execution plan. So model progression. This one's everybody's favorite topic, right? I know it's not mine. And the way we're thinking about it now, we used to have a pretty complicated model progression specification, we called it, that said, okay, at this point in time, the models were going to be this LOD, they were going to have this items, conduit's going to be modeled to this size, so on and so forth. So we have something similar now, right? And I think everybody as an industry, we kind of generally understand what LOD means and what those general levels are. And we kind of think it in that general terms now, right? We're not trying to define it specifically on every single item in the model, this is what LOD it needs to be at, but kind of in a more general sense between the level of development that needs to be put into the model at a certain point, right? So, for example, at SDEs, we're saying that's the early geometric massing and concepts, right? So we're trying to define on those type of projects where we're involved early with the design team, but okay, here's the level of information and thought that we're putting into the model at this certain point. And we'll get a little more granular than this, obviously, and kind of define what some of those elements are and what those key kind of deliverables. So, for example, the VCU Children's Hospital in Richmond that we're working on, we're still putting together our plan, but we have a series of design packages, right? Because construction, we're very focused. We've got to get it done right away, right? We've got to start and release this package while we're still designing the next, and that can create problems. So we're now focused on, okay, we know when these packages are going to come out, so let's really define what's in them and then work backwards from there. And then that'll also help us determine what information are we maybe missing that is still in design that we're going to develop later, right? So, for example, our structural package gets released in July, but the rest of the bulk of our interiors do not finish up until March, April of next year. So just thinking about some of your MEP and a lot of your penetrations, we're going to be core drilling the crap out of everything, it sounds like. So if we can then get a little more focused on, all right, well, let's look ahead and see if we can find some of those bigger items, right, and get those coordinated now so we do have some of those penetrations and your major shafts and your slab edges and things like that that are coordinated early on when that concrete package comes out, right? So thinking about it that in more general terms. Also then on the trade partner side, when we put in their contracts of, hey, here's what our modeling requirements are, I'm going back to that digital twin. Our requirements now are, if you're installing it, you're modeling it. And that's the base contract. It doesn't always work that way, obviously, because that doesn't always make sense. But we're not going to try to define what those level of development, what those expectations are early until we have that conversation with them. So we're going to say, you're modeling everything, just that general statement there, and then you come back to us and tell us what actually makes sense for this project from your point of view, right? So we'll take electrical, for example. Modeling every single electrical conduit is a huge pain in the ass and doesn't always make sense schedule-wise or effort-wise, right? So, but there might be an electrical room or highly critical OR or something like that where it does make sense to model to that level, right? So let's have those conversations collaboratively as a team and develop those standards rather than making broad statements early on that can potentially get us in trouble. So next, what are our overall objectives and strategies? So we've thought through what our goals are on the project, but let's think about what team members are actually going to be involved too, right? Excuse me, at certain phases of the project, there's going to be more or less team members involved. So BIM doesn't need to be everything to everybody at all times, right? So what sort of engagement do we need from the right folks? And honestly, I think this we need to update this slide a little bit, and more of these folks do need to move back in here. And that's not to say that they're not involved at that point, but they're not directly contributing to work or developing work at that point. And I think this slide defines that a little bit more too, with breakdown of roles and responsibilities for people. And this one is a huge one for us right now on the coordination side. Traditionally, MEP, BIM coordination's been a very siloed effort for the GC. There's the BIM manager, VDC manager from the GC that sits with his counterparts on all of the design team, or the trade partners, and they'll collaboratively work in the group, do clash detection, come up with that, but there's no input from the foreman or the superintendents or the project managers in terms of constructability and all of the knowledge that they have of how a project actually goes together. So those folks aren't technical BIM experts, right? But they don't need to be. They are kind of your information users, right? They have that constructability review. They need to know things like model navigation, how to add comments in a model, how to approve a model, and then even get into some more advanced workflows of progress tracking, production tracking, and status updating in the field using the models. So kind of simple, but defining what their roles are. And then during coordination, you guys need to be in every coordination meeting, providing that. DPR now, our VDC team we don't run coordination meetings, we don't run the process, we set it up from a technical standpoint and provide support, but we turn it over to the project engineers and the MEP coordinators and superintendents to lead that effort, and they're the face of it, so they're the ones that are working with their counterparts on the design team or the trade partner side to resolve these issues, right? We're not doing clash detection even. We do, but we don't rely on it anymore. Okay? So visual mapping and visual controls are next. These are a huge part for everybody to understand, again, what their roles and responsibilities are, and even tying back to some of the earlier topics on when everything needs to happen and to what level, right? Because people aren't going to read through a 100-page BIM execution plan, right? So let's pull out some of that important information, put it into something visual in a simple workflow that is easily communicated to everybody, right? So here's just some examples. These are some swim lanes of showing responsibilities. Actually, I have a better one on the next slide. Yeah. So in this case, we've broken it up between the tools. So we've got Navisworks, BIM 360 Glue, and your authoring software. And then starting from model authoring, federated setup, coordination, sign-off, and final sign-off. And then it's hard to read, I know, but each one of these little white boxes, these are who's responsible for that. So again, just a visual way to understand that. Here's another example. Instead of the software now, we've got the team members on this side and what that process looks like. This is our typical weekly coordination workflow, right? So, starting with the trade modeler, publishing to glue. We have a subsidiary company in India called vConstruct that does all of our heavy lifting. They run our clash tests and group clashes for us, prioritize issues. So that's showing their involvement and when they're involved, and then what everybody else's responses are, or responsibilities are for the rest of the week. So on a typical week, this is what you'll be doing. It helps our teams to plan for resources. One of the big challenges we had to overcome initially with having the operations teams take over coordination is say, all right, we already overload our PEs with a ton of responsibilities as it is, so do we need to get a second PE or shift some of their responsibilities? And that's where vConstruct has came in as well, where some of the again, heavy lifting, busy work type tasks, we're putting it on them, allowing our PEs to add value and actually resolve some of these issues and look for issues within the coordination process. Okay? So milestones and deliverables. This is absolutely huge and critical. I mentioned about the design packages and defining when those dates are, what's involved with them. Thinking about it from a risk management standpoint and change management. So as we're going through coordination, if we've, on the design team side, they've designed it to that point, it's been handed over to the contractor and the trade partners, we've coordinated it all, we've put the models into fabrication, we've even delivered materials to the site. Now when the client makes a change for that area, there's a lot of work that's associated with incorporating that change, right? And there's impacts to cost and schedule that are more apparent or less apparent than just the extension of the duration of construction, right? I mean, there's time for on the design side to remodel all of that, to re-coordinate it, time for the GC and the trade partners to do their coordination, lost materials for having to refab, so on and so forth, right? So how do we really capture that and say that we have been finished with coordination? And that's having this strong sign-off schedule for coordination and even design as well. So say we've broken down our models and the project into certain areas, your location breakdown structure, right, of how we're actually going to tackle it and coordinate it and build it. So when we get to a certain area and we've all agreed as a team that it is ready for construction, we've resolved all the major issues, we'll do a sign-off. And how we do that is we'll archive the model at that certain point in time. We'll reference that. It's saved on a location box or glue or BIM 360 or whatever. And there's a sign-off sheet that goes, okay, this model dated such and such. Here's any open items that are still left to be coordinated. We're all in agreement that it's coordinated to this point and that we're moving on. And then that gives us a leg to stand on with the client to say, hey, we've already signed off and moved on to other areas. Now you're making changes, and here's all of the impacts for that. First off, do you actually want to make these changes? And if you do, here's what the implications are going to be. This last bullet too, so understanding how much a model can be relied upon at any given time. This is pretty huge during design especially. Obviously we can't extract a ton of data during SDs and rely on some things when a lot of the design is still in flux, right? So setting those expectations on what the model can and can't be used for at any given time. Here's an older example of a coordination schedule that we've put together. And I think the big things here are, if you look at it, these different keys, we're taking the construction milestone and we're working backwards from there. So we've considered what that coordination driver is going to be. It could be the installation of overhead MEP, it might be a slab pour, so on and so forth. But working backwards from there, from fab and delivery, design team review, submittal prep, coordination, model development, when do we actually need to start for that area? So being clear and deliberate on what those expectations are. And then this is broken down by that location breakdown, area A for floors 1 through whatever. All right, so we've talked about a lot already, so I think this is kind of the big, and I'm running short on time, but I want everybody to note that it's taking us this long to actually talk about the tools, right? So it's one of the lower priority things that we'll need to get to, because a lot of these things can be interchangeable, and especially design trades are going to have different capabilities, or not just design too, but our trade partners between AutoCAD and Revit, different technical capabilities, so it needs to be flexible. But defining these things are important, right? Your standards for AutoCAD, and obviously then during design, if we're involved, we rely heavily on the design partners for that, but in a design assist project, we're heavily involved, and DPR does a lot of self-perform work as well, so we are actually developing our own model content and developing drawings from that, so we are heavily involved in design, especially with, we have a subsidiary company in Phoenix that does digital fabricated wall panels, and a lot of those are interior structural panels, so we have our own engineers that work directly with the design team as well, so they're very heavily involved with that. So some of your other technical guidelines, obviously your coordinate systems, AutoCAD, Revit standards. Model tolerance is a huge one. So a lot of people get this confused with field tolerance. So we'll say your models have to be accurate and precise up to 1/8 of an inch of actual size and 1/2 an inch of location. And we're not talking about that's how precise they need to be in the field. I mean, most of the time we're literally talking about the settings within Revit on here's what those accuracy settings are. So it's pretty much in there, but people can get pretty hung up on it. What are the meeting procedures, model sharing guidelines? That's a huge one. And then I talked about the coordination sign-off. So Jeff, I can go through this pretty quick, but am I good? Yeah. So managing risk. Again, the VDC Execution Plan really helps with that, right? So we've defined all of our processes. We understand maybe where we are exposed to more risk, but knowing that, we can tackle it and prepare for it better, right? So some of the big things that it helps with, claims that services were not provided as expected, right? If we're building that digital twin, it's the exact replica of what we're building, so there should be no discrepancies in everybody's understanding. Change orders from VDC services, again, if we have that schedule in place and what the expectations are, we're not going to accept them if they didn't meet that unless there was a change, legitimate change from the client, and now we have that documentation in place to back up that. And then fee erosion caused by different understandings of VDC obligations. That one's a pretty big one. Legal protections. So we do have some legal language in our execution plan, and we're actually trying to move some of that out and put it more into the contract in either your A2s, or we have an Exhibit 4 to our contract that talks about VDC requirements. But regardless of where it lives, there's kind of two big things we look at. So first off, design firms are still responsible for design, and the contractor is still responsible for means and methods. There's still that clear traditional line in the sand, right? BIM doesn't change that. And then a team's contractual liability to others is governed by the project contract. Having BIM, having somebody else's model, again, doesn't change that. Same thing with sharing drawings. Just because you have a floor plan of something doesn't mean that you can modify that floor plan or deviate from it in any way. And in most of the cases now, the 2D set of documents still govern what actually gets built, so there's still that requirement. And a team member is not responsible for changes made by another party without that model author's approval, right? So we're sharing models, we can all download them from the cloud. Doesn't mean that trade partner A is responsible if trade partner B goes in, changes a bunch of stuff, and re-uploads it for him. So we have the methods to track that now. I won't spend a whole lot of time on this one because it's kind of somewhat irrelevant these days, but digital data use agreements and waiver forms. I mean, we still see these all the time from design teams that send over, hey, I'm not going to share my model unless you sign this waiver form. And that waiver says, here's the model, but you can't actually use it for anything. So having the VDC execution plan in place with those protections, with the collaborativeness that we're all trying to focus on, that should be the governing factor, and not having to share waivers back and forth. And really, once we talk through that and having that strong plan in place, it makes sense, right? Once we're all in agreement that here's what the models are used for, here's what we can and can't do with them, having some of that language in there to protect ourselves, that should be sufficient for the waiver form and take the place of it, and really adds for the more collaborativeness of the process. Last point is just buying it right then with the trade partners. So I think the biggest thing here, the point I'm trying to make is coordination. Regardless, you take BIM out of the picture, coordination is a base contract obligation of the trade partners. They are responsible for coordinating their work with the other trades, and VDC and BIM is just the tool that we use to do that. So they are responsible for it. It should not be an additional charge. At least we try to push that across. I've gotten arguments with subs before where it's they have a line item for coordination and then a separate item for BIM, and we've rejected it and said, no, why are these two separate things? Or they put a number for coordination in, but don't make any mention of BIM. And bad on us for not reviewing that, but it gets back to it and say, no, you had a number for coordination, you've got money in there. The contract states that VDC is the method that we're using. So again, that process is already in place, and we try to enforce that with our trade partners. But so that's it. I appreciate it. Thanks everyone, and thanks for having me.